The question I have is, does 1 Corinthians 9 support the idea of giving a salary to a pastor? Many Christians will cite verses in 1 Corinthians 9 in defense of the idea that pastors are indeed entitled to some kind of financial compensation or a wage or a salary for their work. Often they'll cite 1 Corinthians 9:14, which says, "Even so has the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel." However, if you look at the context of this chapter and you take in consideration the words of Christ on this matter, Paul doesn't really have money or salary in view. What Paul is talking about is how gospel workers have the right to have their basic needs met as they go about their gospel work. For example, in 1 Corinthians 9:4, earlier in the chapter, Paul says, "Do we not have the right to eat and drink?" And Paul is asking this rhetorical question in order to impress upon the Corinthians and us, is that he as an apostle was entitled to receive food and drink from those he ministered to as he engaged in his apostolic work. Now Paul provides the basis for this right, which is the very words of Jesus Christ himself. In verse 14, Paul says, "Even so has the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel." But where did Jesus actually speak about preachers of the gospel being sustained by the gospel? Well, among other texts, we see in Luke chapter 10, verse 7, Jesus says to the disciples, and he's giving them instructions in regard to their labors in the ministry, and he says, "And in the same house remain, eating and drinking such things as they give, for the laborer is worthy of his hire. Go not from house to house." So we see it's not as though Jesus was ordaining that the evangelist can receive some kind of wage or financial compensation for their labors. It was just that they were to allow themselves to receive hospitality from others, eating and drinking whatever their hosts gave them. Now, this is what Jesus implies when he speaks of a laborer is worthy of his hire. He's not talking about a wage. He's just talking about having one's basic needs met. Now this is further reinforced in Matthew chapter 10, verses 7 through 10, where Jesus is giving instructions to his disciples before sending them out to serve. And he says to them, "Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons. You receive without pay, give without pay. Acquire no gold, nor silver, nor copper for your belts, no bag for your journey, nor 2 tunics, nor sandals, nor staff, for the laborer deserves his food." Now note first of all that Jesus tells his disciples to give without pay. Jesus basically forbidding his disciples from receiving money in exchange for using their spiritual gifts for the good of others. But then Jesus goes on to tell them not to acquire gold, nor silver, nor copper. This would imply that they were not to take any money with them, nor seek to raise money as they labored. However, while they were not to accept payment for their work, they were entitled to receive something, and that was food and shelter and drink from others. For similar to the passage in Luke chapter 10, verse 7, Jesus says in Matthew 10:10, the laborer deserves his food. So they were entitled to have their very basic needs met. But that does not mean they were entitled to a wage or a salary. Jesus clearly forbids them from receiving payment for their spiritual labors. Now the reason why I cite these passages is to help shed light on what Paul means in 1 Corinthians 9 when he speaks about gospel workers living of the gospel. Paul is not speaking about workers receiving a wage or a salary at all. Paul clearly states he's basically referring to having a right to eat and drink. He says this in verse 4. And in support of his position, he cites the teaching of Jesus on this matter. Again, Jesus taught that his disciples were not to receive pay for their spiritual labors, but they were entitled to food and drink, because as Jesus says, the labor is worthy of his hire. And so to answer the original question I asked, the answer is no. The passages in 1 Corinthians 9 does not justify giving a salary to a pastor for his spiritual labors. 1 Corinthians 9, Paul was simply speaking of workers, gospel workers having a right to receive hospitality, having their basic needs met from those they minister to. Thank you and God bless.